Good day, I'm Jemsek, MD, infectious disease specialist. I have a clinic here in Washington, D.C. for the past 10 years. Love the location, about 30 employees, several providers. We focus on Lyme Borreliosis complex, and I'll define that later. My background is HIV/AIDS, which I started within a couple years of my graduating my fellowship in Charlotte, North Carolina. I, in fact, was the first doctor to diagnose a case of HIV. Well, it had no name at that point in 1980, early 83. And then cases started coming, and by 85 we had an etiology, and then we had the virus was discovered, we had a name. So anyway, I was heavily involved in this horrible disease and pretty much turned everything over to treatment of the disease. We had no drugs through the 80s. The drugs we had from 89 through 95 were all nucleosides and toxic as heck. And so Magic Johnson, if you remember, turned the corner because he was a prominent basketball figure. He didn't play in one of the championship series because he developed what he called the HIV virus, which should be just HIV. Anyway, he was on AZT and 3TC, I'm sure, because that's all they had. Johnson's a very lucky man to have survived because the nucleosides could generally carry a patient for a couple of years, and then the inevitable decline would occur. Many patients died. He didn't. He's very fortunate. By the mid-90s, other drugs came, new cocktails, and now it's a one-pill treatment. It's pretty straightforward and pretty easy. It's nothing compared to the horror and terror that occurred for the first 20 years of the illness. I guess I have a propensity to deal with complex medical patients. Lyme, Borreliosis, I'd seen in the 80s. I didn't think anything about it. I didn't want anything to do with it. I was all HIV/AIDS. But I knew it existed. I said, yeah, it's a chronic disease, and it's chronic recurrent, big deal. I had no idea there was any controversy involved in this illness, none whatsoever. When I opened my AIDS clinic in Huntersville in 2000, after my clinic blew up, I had 10 or 12 employees who were doing HIV/AIDS only. But a couple of patients with what they called Lyme disease walked in. And the internet was just coming into its own, and I wasn't involved in the internet. I didn't know what a web page was. I didn't know what a blog was. I had no clue. I didn't want to know, honestly. But people now were starting to talk to other people. And patients with what they call Lyme disease came in ass over teacup. And in a year or two, I had as many patients with Lyme, which I call Lyme Borreliosis complex now, as I did with HIV/AIDS. I was carrying 300 patients with AIDS, HIV at that point. The largest clinic in the state, larger than the universities. But we also had this Lyme complex. So I began to study it and become fascinated by it. I read about the organism. I actually, with a lot of help, wrote a long web page to kind of go through it. I devised some symptom characteristics that we could follow. I marveled at the diversity of the illness and the severity of the illness. Of course, I didn't know how to treat it, so we did, what everybody did for a while. But then I understood epiphany that, oh my God, co-infections are very important. So early on, one of our many innovations was to accept that co-infections were part and parcel of this illness. And we were the first to say and do that. One thing led to another, and our treatments became more complex. And as everyone knows, in 2005, I was arraigned by the North Carolina Medical Board. Even though I'd won the top award in the state 5 years earlier, awarded by Governor Hunt, the Certificate of Appreciation was the very highest award that you can possibly give to a civilian for my work in HIV/AIDS, given on an as-determined basis. So here I was, I won this wonderful award and been acknowledged and had other awards, and now I'm at the medical board with a bunch of people who are self-righteous, and I think we had some help from the Northeast for sure. I think some of the Wormser types, not saying Wormser did it, but those types were calling down and saying, get Jemsek. I know that for a fact. Anyway, my license was taken away and with immediate stay. I mean, I still have my license, but in June of 2006, and eventually the final edict came in August, I could only treat for 60 days. And I can't get people better in 60 days. And I asked if I could do the 60 days over 6 months or 8 months, which I probably could get people better. And they said, no, it has to be 2 months. So, I mean, it's just like arguing with the Lord. And I moved on to South Carolina, where I had some freedom. And from there, I had the opportunity to come to Washington, D.C. And after a 2-year interview, D.C. Welcomed me with open arms. There were some wonderful people on the medical board, a wonderful attorney, Greenhaw, who sort of understood and said I was probably a pioneer in certain areas. He wrote a lovely letter. It was shocking. And so I've come to D.C. And it's not that we haven't had criticism from self-righteous doctors, but by and large, things are starting to cool down. And oh my goodness, there's so much going on in the Lyme world. It's just, the problem is there's so much confusion, chaos, entropy. So there's no coordinated effort. If you have 100 different doctors or naturopaths treating, you're going to do it 100 different ways. Well, that's not satisfactory. So I had referenced Global Lyme Alliance earlier. Our protocols work, but I'm sure they could be better. And I'm sure that we like to think we treat 6 pathogens primarily, but I know there's another dozen, perhaps less virulent pathogens that can be opportunistic, which we don't really know about. We know the gut is heavily involved with the immune system, leaky gut, causing all kinds of problems. We understand the importance of stressors. The etiology of this illness is, I'm going to shock you a little bit. I think most everybody's infected with the spirochete, either through sexual encounter or an incidental bite. Could even be a mosquito bite, because we don't know. But once it's in, it's in. That doesn't mean that you're going to be ill. But then if you get a consortium of other infections, namely babesiosis, along with Bartonella, which most of us acquire naturally, Mycoplasma, Chlamydia, Proteomyxoma, and then all the parasites in the gut, which are undiagnosable, if you will. You have quite a mess on your hand. You have a huge infection load. And the co-infections are like wingmen. They facilitate the spread of the spirochete. This often occurs when there's a stress involved. It could be another infection. It could be a life stress. It could be on a continuum, or it could be something we just fall off the cliff. You have a car accident, and all of a sudden, you have all these neurologic symptoms. If you look carefully back at the patient, you'll see that they were smoldering along and making compensation. So people sleep longer. They go to gluten-free because their neighbor says to do so. They do a little light exercise. They do all these things to compensate. They take supplements. But at some point, that oxidative stress needle is so far over, they can't compensate anymore. And then the body starts to break down. The spirochete has its way because it can invade any cell in the body, any neurologic cell. There are many, many neurologic cells, many compartments in the brain, in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the spirochete can invade them all. And we know this from studies done in 2006 by Livingood. And I know it clinically. So our presentations are chronic fatigue, because the chronic inflammatory phenomenon will deplete the potential in the mitochondria, so the electron transport system can't make ATP, which makes energy. That's number one. On top of that, you have all other kinds of reasons to have fatigue, including hormonal issues, emotional issues, sleep issues, pain issues, other outliers in the laboratory work, lack of support. And we look at all these things and will not treat a patient unless some of the key elements I just mentioned are stabilized. Our treatment is a lot like chemo. It's done in progressions. It's several days a month. It's pulsed. It's not every day. We know that there's a balance that needs to be struck, because this disease is unlike any other disease in that treatment provokes an immense inflammatory response, several times more, many-fold more than with killing a gram-negative bacteria with the lipopolysaccharide. Lipoprotein in the spirochete is what's responsible. At the same time, we're incidentally breaking down biofilm by accident using certain drugs, and that, of course, creates inflammatory chaos. Our treatment involves calculated use of sugar alcohols and lactoferrin to break down biofilm in a certain period of time, and then we stop. And then we do a cleanup or a kill zone. You have to kill what comes out of the biofilm. So it's all well and good to take lumpectinase and nattokinase and serrapeptidase. That's not really fine. So if you're going to do that, you need to have some sort of sequencing and kill what comes out of the biofilm. And guess what? Babesia lives in the biofilm. No wonder there's so many persistent infections and relapses. So we see that our immune systems are rebuilding. I'd love to, with Global Lyme Alliance, I'd love to show how that happens because the patient obviously gets more immune confident. The better they do, the less we do in terms of treatment. But our treatments are aggressive. About 15% of our folks will go to an intravenous treatment. But importantly, even in our highly disadvantaged population, we can still treat 80% or more with oral programs. Probably a few more need IV. You can't afford it. Insurance companies don't cover it because they just don't have enough money, do they, folks? Billions in the coffers, and worse for money. Part of our problem, quite honestly, is to have a formalized approach, working with scientists, academicians, getting scientific data, and that has to happen. As advocates, you just can't say, well, I get people better and I do it my way. Remember I said there were 100 different ways, and we see them all. And we learn and we adjust. It's not like we're locked into something. And our patients, are individuals, and so they're treated as individuals. But eventually we have to have the science. We have to have a name for this illness. We don't have a name. I mean, I've used the word Lyme Borreliosis complex forever because I think the word Lyme is important. Borreliosis, of course, is the bacterial genus, and the complex refers to a multifactorial infection with many pathogens, multisystemic infection with the spirochete able to evade fibroblasts, lymphocytes, and of course all the neuronal cells, multi-compartmental neurologic disease. So any part of the central or peripheral nervous system can be involved. Immunosuppressive disease. Those are the key points. There are many others, but the mankind has never seen this before. Put it this way: this disease has evolved, and I think teleologically, it'd be good to look at somebody really smart say, okay, how did this happen? Is it global warming? Is it eco changes in terms of taking away natural reservoirs for the rodents and their predators and so forth? They're closer to society. I don't know. I'm not sure what has happened. Some people just say it's global warming. I don't think it's that simple. In any event, we have a new disease which, by the way, can, in my view, through its immunosuppression and direct invasion of tissues in the genetically susceptible, be associated with a host of other chronic illnesses of unknown etiology. Outside cardiovascular disease, or even including cardiovascular disease and pulmonary disease, the 20 top diagnoses, we don't know the etiology except for HIV/AIDS and H. pylori. None of the neurodegenerative diseases have a known etiology. None of the rheumatic diseases have a known etiology. Poor rheumatologist doesn't know the cause of anything they treat except for gout. All the skin disorders, the GI disorders are of an unknown disease. We're not so smart, are we? We're just not that smart. And yet, so what we do is everybody tries to immunosuppress that patient with steroids and metabolic drugs to calm down the immune system, when in fact the immune system needs to be trained up. As we take our patient, and a lot of our folks, this is a study that needs to be done, is what's the incidence of co-infections, comorbidities in our population. So just guessing, I'd say 25% of our folks have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is not a hard thing to deal with. Probably 20% interstitial cystitis. You're starting to get the idea now about what's happening. Pituitary adenomas, pineal gland cyst, on and on and on and on. And this all needs to be cataloged, because then this disease becomes proportionally more important, does it not? So if you have this horrible disease on its own, which has come on as an epidemic, pandemic, debilitating, life-altering, relationship-altering, career-altering, and most people cannot access care because there isn't good care. Now, some people can talk about detox and get up to a certain point, but very few people know how to treat or have the success that we need. So we need to, again, make this its own discipline, get the science, which is the Global Lyme Alliance and our going to do the first ever study and start to get some data and move on from there. That'll be very exciting. So when I was in UK, I gave a 4-hour one-day conference, which is lovely. The Natasha Metcalf and others just did a wonderful job of getting it set up, and I did an examination, showed a couple movies, did a Q&A and all. But when I got there, we had talked about doing a pamphlet. I'd love for LD UK and Lyme Disease UK, which has 10,000 members, and just got its charitable certification, and Global Lyme Alliance to coordinate and make a booklet like this to help the 95% of people who can't access medical care or who cannot afford it. When I say access medical care, I mean competent care, which is rare. So we created a booklet, which I can't go through page by page, but essentially it's self-help tools to manage Lyme Borreliosis complex. And it's got my name on it, but so many people contributed. Andrea Caesar, who wrote Twist of Lyme, my friend Dr. O'Flynn contributed. We'd like to get more contributors, but we talk about diet, we talk about meditation, we talk about detoxing with baths, and it's about a 10-page booklet. It's really cool, really nice. So I'd like to do a second version of that one day and make it available to everyone online. You think everybody knows how to detox or what to do about gluten, and you just assume that they already know that. Many do, but many don't. So I have a great deal of empathy for the millions of people who can't access care. I have more empathy even for children who are afflicted and can't access care because their lives are truncated. I have empathy for relationships that shatter in all kinds of different ways because of the stress of being a caregiver and the change in the relationships that occur with a very sick patient who has neuropsychiatric issues and great needs. I care a great deal about promising people who've had great careers aborted because they cannot go on any further. But I've also returned some of those people back to the workplace. This disease is immensely challenging. I think it's more complex than HIV/AIDS. Let me put it this way, if I knew what I knew now in HIV/AIDS, I would have been a much better HIV doctor because I've learned about pain management, sleep management, gut health, more about the immune system. I become a neurologist, and that's why it needs to be its own discipline. It's basically, you need to be competent in several areas. It's not that we don't consult with specialists, we do. We like to make friends, and we want their advice, and we learn from them and they learn from us. But so many people are afflicted, so if we can get some simple advice out there to them in the next year or so to help them manage this in a sensible way, then that's a start. I want to thank you for this time. I'll be doing more video interviews as time goes on, and I'd like some feedback as to whether this was too much information or too complex, because I can take it at different levels in the future. And again, I very much appreciate the time that we're spending together today. Thank you.